Hello everyone. Okay then. So the latest instalment of Russian history. This session should see us to the end of Alexander II. Um, Also, of course, it would have been the Easter holidays, wouldn't it, as of Friday? So again, so for 2 weeks, which was the Easter holidays, then I won't be doing any videos for that 2 weeks. If we're back in 2 weeks' time, I'll say in 2 weeks' time, and if not, then I will resume my YouTube videos when we get back. Okay then, so before then, you need to make sure, those who haven't so far, that you get your coursework proposal forms in. Need to be in by tomorrow, i.e. Friday. It'll give me and Liz a chance to look through them then. We can give yay or nay at them, which we'll do over the Easter holidays, I suppose. And also remember those two sources which I set on Monday or Tuesday. They need doing by Friday lunchtime as well, so it means I can have a chance to look at them early on at the weekend or early on next week. So that is the general kind of plan. I'm also, by the way, going to set you an interpretation question on Alexander II. As I said before, Alexander II does pop up as an interpretation area. I do have two of these historical interpretations, so I'll set you the question. If you'd like, I'll do a pro forma like I did for the source question, just to help guide you. And basically, that would need to be done for after what would have been Easter holidays, so 2 weeks on Monday, basically. And if you can't remember how to do the interpretation questions, if you look at one of my YouTubes from last week, I think it's even called How to Interpretation Questions or something like that. That should tell you how to do them. Right, so last time we met, we were kind of doing the opposition to Alexander, and poor old Alexander got bumped off, hadn't he? We had some of these revolutionaries who, like the People's Will or Popular, whatever it was called, who basically said, people should just try to kill the regime, and that's it. So what we're going to look at today very quickly is, how did Alexander respond to this threat of disorder? Because as we know, and as we should already be aware, there was an assassination attempt against him in the early 1860s, and we're already aware a little bit about how he appointed more conservatives and how he rode back and became generally more conservative. Now, this PowerPoint I'm very quickly going to go over is actually on Moodle. It's under Resources of Alexander II, then under Repression of Alexander II. I'll just very quickly go through some of the key features of it, and it does kind of match up with some questions in your work booklet, so hopefully it should be relatively straightforward. Just loading it up on my screen so I can see it myself. Here it is. So the first question is on there is, given the threat of terrorism, how do you think the government would react? And as we know that most governments, and Alexander II was not unusual in this, when a government feels threatened, the lives of the people are being threatened or whatever, they tend to react by having more repressive measures, don't they? Just think about Britain following, the 9/11 attacks in New York and the attacks in London. The government then passed a series of anti-terror laws. Well, the government of Alexander II was not that different, okay? They began to crack down on signs of opposition to the regime. Okay, so one area and one cause of difficulty for Alexander was actually in Poland. Okay, Poland was being run by the Russians, part of the Russian Empire. In 1863, Alexander thought he was being nice to Poland by giving them extra freedoms, but in 1863 there's actually an uprising against the Tsarist regime in Poland. This led to the near assassination of Alexander's brother, Grand Duke Constantine. He was very much a liberal reformer, and so as a consequence of this uprising, Alexander does strike quite harshly against the Poles. He sends down a guy called General Muraviev, what should you say his name, who reportedly said en route to Poland, the only good Pole is a hanged Pole. So as you can see, he wasn't going to go down there with kind of swinging some light, was he? He was kind of going to go down there to kind of kick ass, essentially. Roughly 22,000 Poles were actually executed or transferred to Siberia, under this general. The university in Warsaw was closed down. They also banned the Polish language being used in kind of administration, and it was replaced by Russian. So, things like birth certificates and all that kind of stuff, instead of being done in Polish, they were done in Russian instead. And this idea of trying to make Poland into Russia is known as Russification, and something we will come across when we do about the nationalities. The big issue with Poland then and now is that the Catholic Church was very significant in Poland. Obviously, many Catholics saw allegiance to the Vatican and to Rome, and I suppose a little bit like Henry VIII feared Catholics, isn't he, and their relationship with the Vatican. And so Alexander, again, he tried to end communication between Poland and the Vatican and to try and rule Poland much more directly from St. Petersburg. So he was trying to kind of split off the Catholic Church and trying to obviously deal with Poland in that way. So quite a tough kind of reaction to this uprising in Poland. Regarding opposition within Russia itself, as we know, there was that assassination attempt on Alexander. There's also opposition from conservatives who didn't like the reforms he was making, and as we know from previous lessons, there's quite a lot of opposition from people who thought he hadn't gone far enough, and then there's this growing threat of revolutionaries that were appearing. Alexander does seem to believe that to some extent some of his liberal education reforms he'd made, he thinks may have helped to trigger off some of this. His reduction of censorship as well, again, this was allowing criticism of the Tsar to be made, which again, he kind of believes was kind of fueling the fire, I suppose. And so what he does for education, he appoints someone called Count Tolstoy as Minister for Education, and he basically encourages much greater censorship of universities, trying to close down some of those student magazines and newspapers and stuff that were criticising the Tsar. In terms of the national curriculum, as much as it was, subjects that encouraged independent thought, which Alexander had initially kind of encouraged, subjects like history, which obviously encourages questioning and evidence, Russian, science, which again is very much inquiry based, isn't it, and wondering why things happen the way they do. Modern languages as well, also seen as being studied that encourage independent thought, because obviously you have to learn about different cultures outside Russia. These were discouraged under Tolstoy, and instead he had much greater emphasis on reinstating church history being introduced into Russia again. So the history of the Orthodox Church, Greek and Latin, because obviously they are kind of dead languages, aren't they? So it's quite safe to study Greek culture and Latin culture of the Romans and stuff, because obviously they have little impact on modern life. In terms of the security forces, a guy called Shuvalov, who we've mentioned before, he's been on a couple of cahoots as well, was appointed in 1866. And he preferred to rule by decree and military courts to deal with suspects. So rule by decree means that the Tsar and the Tsar only should decide things, and he should basically just pass an order saying, I want this to happen, and it happens. Military court to deal with suspects. So again, some of those judicial reforms Shuvalov was not a great fan of, all this faffing around with juries and all the rest of it. Much better to deal with it in a military kind of way. He very much supported increased censorship, which did increase in this time. And as a consequence of all these reforms, what you begin to see was the intelligentsia, these more liberal-minded people, it just increased their opposition to the regime, essentially. In terms of the populace, over 1,600 were arrested between 1873 and 1877. Most of them were then found guilty, and most of them were then sent off into Siberia, into exile, which isn't the nicest place to go. So this is how things tend to be in the 1870s. And it's not towards the end of his reign that Alexander then begins to relax again and begins to try and reduce this repression down. So in 1880, he replaces Shuvalov with a guy called Loris Melikov, who's much more liberally minded. it'd been interesting to see what would have happened had he lived, essentially, because obviously he gets assassinated not long afterwards. But had he lived, it'd be interesting to see how Loris Malikov would have actually dealt with the situation. As I said before, Alexander does talk about further constitutional change literally on the day in which he gets blown up, which kind of puts an end to that. So, sorry. So, you have this period of repression, which kind of covers the mid to end of Alexander's reign. What I want you to do is I want you to read the Acton book. There's a copy of it on Moodle. You need page 89 where it talks about General Loris Malenkov and that area. Feel free though and take notes on the previous pages of his chapter, which kind of covers Alexander's reign and it covers his reforms and then sort of his repression. So if I were you, I'd take notes from the rest of his chapter on Alexander's reign in order to increase your knowledge. But you definitely need the end bit to do question 4 and 5. Okay. What else I'd like to do, please, is you'll notice there's a table in your booklet there. It's called Using Evidence to Support Different Interpretations. So again, this is just to try and make you think about if you see a statement from a historian, what evidence could you use to support it? So where would you say this is an accurate view because ... What would your ... be, essentially? So basically I've got 4 interpretations. I just made them up. Alexander is to be seen as reforming Tsar and brought significant benefits to Russian people. So what evidence is there from anything we've done on Alexander to say, yeah, that's true, actually, was a great reformer? What evidence is there for the second one, that his main aim was to preserve the Tsarist autocracy? So, okay then, so what evidence could you put in there? What evidence is that his reforms may have looked radical on the surface, but actually they weren't? And what evidence is to say that his reforms had unforeseen consequences that proved to be dangerous to his regime in the end? Okay, so you need to use all your knowledge. Okay, that's where things go a bit wrong, in order to complete those 4 interpretations. And at the end, think about which interpretation do you think is the best one to sum up Alexander, and why do you have that view? Okay, so that all needs to be done. Then we'll finish it off then on Alexander. So as I said, it's Easter next 2 weeks, so obviously I won't be doing any videos because it would have been like the Easter holidays. But I want you to do the interpretation assessment, which I will send out. And also make sure you read that bit. I might make you do some reading from Westwood as well. Again, I'll put it onto an email if I decide to make you do that. So over the next 2 weeks, have a nice holiday, so to speak. Don't get too bored sat inside. Feel free to look through all your previous notes, fill in bits which you don't have. However, it is like the holidays, so to speak, so I'll probably be in my garden most of it, so I won't be answering that many emails and stuff. If you're back in 2 weeks, I'll see you in 2 weeks. If not, which I suspect might be the case, I will obviously do some more videos when we get back. Okay, any questions? Let me know. Oh yeah, don't forget to get those coursework things into me ASAP as well. Okay then.